Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming from near and far away. My name is Jason Walsh. I'm a senior policy advisor here at the White House. We are very excited to be hosting the White House Summit on Nuclear Energy and to be joined by such an impressive audience and such a great group of speakers. You should all have an agenda or be sitting next to someone who has an agenda or have seen an agenda at some point in the last couple of hours. You'll see that we have 3 panels of speakers this afternoon who will discuss the importance of nuclear power across multiple vectors and actions being taken today and into the future to sustain and advance nuclear power. We will also hear from a number of young scientists and engineers who we think are representative of the next generation, the new generation entering the field of nuclear energy and moving it forward. And as bookends to this afternoon, you'll hear from 2 administration leaders, Dr. John Holdren and Dr. Liz Sherwood-Randall. For the panels, you'll hear remarks from our moderators and speakers and questions from moderators to speakers. We'll also have about 10 minutes at the end of each panel for questions from the audience. The way that we're going to do this is that at some point over the course of the panel, probably after remarks, the moderator will say, if you have a question, raise your hand, and then we'll have a couple of folks passing out cards. You'll write down your question and then pass the note back to the person you got the card from, and we will somehow try to make sense of all of that. I want to give thanks to a couple of organizations. There were a number of organizations who helped us put this together. I want to single out a couple. First to Third Way for being really invaluable partners in helping us think through this event and also design the agenda, the third panel of which John Cowan, president of Third Way, will be moderating at the end. I also want to thank Idaho National Laboratory. Those of you who come to White House events know that our typical practice is to make you as thirsty and hungry and physically uncomfortable as possible. There'll still be some of that, don't worry, but at the break we will have coffee and some refreshments courtesy of INL. So I want to thank them for that, and then incidentally all of their groundbreaking RD&D over multiple generations in nuclear energy technology. Some housekeeping notes: please turn off the ringers of your various devices. As I referenced, there will be a break. It will be after our second panel. There are also, for folks who don't know, bathrooms as you go out. They'll be to your left. Men's, I think, is on the first floor. Women's on the second floor. This summit is being live streamed. So don't say or do anything that you wouldn't want to have end up in the National Archives. And I think that's it. We're really excited that you're all here and that we're doing this summit. On that note, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. John Holdren, who is Assistant to the President for Science and Technology, Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, otherwise known as PCAST. Dr. Holdren holds advanced degrees in aerospace engineering and theoretical plasma physics from MIT and Stanford. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as the former president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In short, he is an underachiever. Dr. Holdren, will you come on up, please? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. And on behalf of President Obama, thanks to all of you for coming. This is an amazing crowd. I have been entertaining myself by reading the list of participants and your affiliations. I have to extend a particular note of thanks to Kirsten Cutler from OSTP for all the work she put in organizing this meeting and helping us recruit such an amazing collection of leaders in this field. As everybody is aware, President Obama considers addressing the global climate change challenge to be a top priority. At the end of August at the Glacier Conference in Alaska, he said the following, quote, "I am convinced that no challenge poses a greater threat to our future and future generations than a changing climate. This is one of those rare issues because of its magnitude, because of its scope, that if we don't get it right, we may not be able to reverse, and we may not be able to adapt sufficiently. There is such a thing as being too late when it comes to climate change," close quote. The challenge of acting in time and ultimately acting adequately is daunting both for the United States and for the world. Let me take a look at the numbers. Most of the world's nations have embraced the goal of holding the increase in the globally and annually averaged near-surface air temperature to 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. Today, we're pushing through 0.9 degrees Celsius and still rising. The middle-of-the-road estimates by the climate science community are that achieving a high likelihood of keeping the ultimate increase below 2 degrees C will require global reductions in the offending emissions, principally greenhouse gases, but also particulate black carbon, by something in the range of 50% below 1990 levels by 2050, and all the way to zero by or before 2100. Under the widely shared assumption that the industrialized countries, having contributed the larger part of cumulative atmospheric buildup of greenhouse gases to date, should go first and initially fastest in emissions reductions, the United States and many other industrial nations have agreed to aim for something like 80% reductions from 1990 levels by 2050. 80%. Now, in terms of heat-trapping potential on a 100-year timescale, carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel use have lately accounted for about 55% of total greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, and carbon dioxide emissions from electric power plants have accounted for about 40% of that, or 22% of the global total. In the United States, CO2 emissions from fossil fuel are about 3/4 of national greenhouse gas emissions, with electric power generation accounting, as it does worldwide, for about 40% of the CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use in total. Thus, in this country, CO2 from power generation is 30% of national emissions of all greenhouse gases, all types. Both for the United States and for the world, the electric power sector is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases among all sectors of human activity. It's bigger than transportation, it's bigger than agriculture, it's bigger than non-electric uses of energy in industry, and it's bigger than non-electric uses of energy in residential and commercial buildings. That means that national and global goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions can only be met with the help of significant emissions reductions in the electric power sector. Indeed, probably larger than proportionate cuts, given the leverage that comes from the degree to which both emissions and decisions in this sector are concentrated in large facilities and large organizations. But achieving reductions in the magnitude required is going to be a huge challenge. Both in the United States and worldwide, 2/3 of electricity generation still comes from burning coal, oil, and natural gas, and virtually all of that without any capture of the carbon dioxide combustion product. 2 billion tons of CO2 per year from fossil fuel power plants in the United States, 13 billion tons worldwide. I might add that over 70% of that global power sector total is coming from coal-fired power plants, more than 70%. Of the 1/3 of global electricity generation currently coming from non-fossil sources, about half is coming from hydropower, 1/3 is coming from nuclear, and 1/6 is coming from non-hydro renewables. In the United States, in round numbers, 60% of the non-fossil generation is nuclear, 20% is hydro, and the last 20% is the non-hydro renewables. But nuclear generation, as everyone in this room knows, I think, has been more or less flat in gigawatt hours generated for a decade, and hydro for far longer than that, fluctuating mainly with differences in runoff. Only the non-hydro renewables have been growing recently, and very dramatically at that. In the case of wind, It increased more than threefold between 2008 and 2014. Solar electricity generation increased more than 20-fold between 2008 and 2014. The most conspicuous greenhouse gas relevant trend on the fossil generation side in the United States has, of course, been the rising prominence of natural gas, which went from 16% of generation in 2000 to 27% in 2014, while coal fell from 52% in 2000 to 39% in 2014. So looking ahead, what are the options for achieving the deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector that are needed? I'm sure everybody in this room could recite the list. It's not that long. Increased efficiency in electricity end use, more switching from coal to natural gas, advanced fossil fuel power plants with higher efficiency and, much more important but also more difficult and costly, the capacity to capture, use, and store carbon dioxide. More renewables for electricity generation, particularly some of the non-hydro renewables, notably wind and solar, that have large potential for further expansion. More nuclear fission, and ultimately, maybe nuclear fusion if it can be made practical and affordable. All of these options have attractions. All of them have shortcomings, including for some hurdles to be overcome in terms of practicality, economics, or public acceptance, with the prospects for overcoming these hurdles subject to considerable uncertainty. Increased end-use efficiency is at least arguably the largest and cheapest option. After all, from 1975 to 2010, the United States reduced the amount of primary energy needed to yield a real dollar of GDP by a factor of 2 at modest and sometimes negative cost. Every respectable study shows that there is much more potential where that came from. But still, efficiency has limits. One still needs supply. And in the case of electricity, there's reason to think that demand will be driven up by such rapidly expanding end uses as the increasing electrification of transportation and perhaps desalination of seawater. As for the supply side, again, I think we all pretty much know where the challenges lie. Burning natural gas still releases a lot of CO2, although much less than coal, and careful attention has to be paid to methane leaks in production and transport to avoid offsetting even that advantage. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage for fossil-fueled power plants is still at an early stage of development, with costs that are highly uncertain, but in no event likely to be attractive unless there is a substantial actual or virtual price on carbon. Intermittent renewables, such as wind and solar, become more challenging with respect to integration with other sources the larger their share becomes, and their cost goes up substantially in circumstances where storage is required. Growing biofuels for electricity generation is demanding of land and water and may compete with food production, as well as entailing high costs in transporting the fuel to centralized power plants. Nuclear fusion, of course, doesn't work yet, and we can't be sure it will, or what it will cost if it does. And as for nuclear fission, the focus of this meeting, I'll come to its challenges in just a moment. But the point I want to make first is that this litany of challenges facing our options for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector is not a reason for taking any of them off the table. Given the importance, indeed the imperative, of electricity supply that is adequate, affordable, reliable, secure, and far more climate-friendly than today's, the only sensible strategy is to do everything we reasonably can do through research, development, innovation, and public-private partnership to master the challenges that each option presents, to give the best chance of being able to fashion a deployed mix of electricity supply options that meets all of these criteria and one other, a high degree of portfolio diversity as a hedge against inevitable uncertainty and surprises. And that precisely is this administration's strategy. Let me turn finally to the challenges facing the nuclear fission option. The challenge is that we must count on research, development, innovation, and public-private partnerships to address. And again, I think we all know what they are. They are to reduce capital cost, to maximize safety against malfunction, mistakes, malevolence, and natural disasters, to manage radioactive waste in ways that are not merely technically sound, but that can gain the confidence of the public, and to minimize the pathways by which nuclear energy technology could contribute to the proliferation of nuclear weapons. What today's meeting is precisely about is how ingenuity and innovation and partnership can contribute to overcoming these challenges and thus to making nuclear energy everything that it can be, and thus a major contributor in this country and worldwide to minimizing the risks from climate change. I look forward to hearing the terrific ideas I'm sure will materialize from this discussion. Thank you very much.